My name is Dr. Alessandro Corda. I'm a reader in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and today we are joined by Professor Joshua Page, who is the Beverly and Richard Fink Professor of Sociology and Law at the University of Minnesota. Josh is a prolific author, and in addition to numerous articles and book chapters, he is the author or co-author of 3 books: the monograph The Toughest Bit, Politics, Punishment, and the Prison Officer Unions in California, based on his doctoral dissertation published in 2011 with OUP. The second book, co-author with Phil Goodman and Michelle Phelps, published in 2017, titled Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice. And then his latest book, co-author with Joe Soss, titled Legal Plunder, The Predatory Dimensions of Criminal Justice, published in 2025 by the University of Chicago Press. So, Josh, welcome to LawPod. I would like to start focusing on your intellectual trajectory. So, what first drew you to the study of punishment and the sociology of criminal justice?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I went to grad school at Berkeley in Northern California to get a PhD in sociology. I didn't go there to study criminal justice. I actually wasn't interested in it. But during my first semester there, while I was doing my studies, I was also interested in getting involved in some community-based work. And email came across. I was looking for volunteer teaching assistants at the college program at San Quentin Prison. And so I thought, hey, that sounded interesting. I volunteered for that, and through that experience, I became fascinated with prisons, with higher education in prisons, and it was through that experience that eventually led me to my master's research on funding for higher education, and then my doctoral dissertation, which was on the politics of punishment in California, and this was in 1998, and ever since I've been in this world.
Your work lies at the intersection of sociology, law, and public policy. So how does this interdisciplinary position shape your approach to the field?
Yeah, my work does lie at that intersection, though I definitely identify first and foremost as a sociologist. I mean, the identification is less important, but the intellectual tradition I was trained in and that I identify most with as a sociologist who studies law and crime, not as much crime, but criminal punishment. So yeah, and my interests have taken me particularly into the world of politics because I'm really interested in penal development, how policies and practices and institutions change or don't change over time, which is a question of politics and is wrapped up in questions of law. How the law changes, how the law is used to both facilitate and obstruct change. And so, yeah, I think, I do draw on resources from all 3 fields as well as some others. But, in terms of how I approach these topics, the kinds of questions I ask, the theoretical resources I tend to bring to them, the debates I tend to engage, are pretty centrally located in sociology.
I would like to briefly focus on the 3 books I mentioned to kind of chart your intellectual trajectory and scholarly production. So let's start with the toughest bit. So what led you to focus on California prison officers' unions, and what surprised you the most during your work on this project?
Yeah. Well, that goes back to the first question we talked about how I became interested in this. I was teaching at San Quentin, and again, I became really interested. I saw how powerful this program was, how much it meant to the guys in the prison, how much it seemed to be sort of benefiting the prison, and sort of wondering why aren't there more of these? And that led me to research the federal government's decision in 1994 to eliminate Pell Grants. Incarcerated folks access to Pell Grants, which was the main funding source for higher education. And so that was a political question. And it was during that time I was interested in that. I set up an interview with a state senator, this guy by the name of Richard Polanco, who was very involved in penal policy at the state level. And I wanted to interview him because I had heard he was interested in legislation to fund higher education in prisons. And so I went to interview him and he didn't show up. So they had me meet with his head staff person. And he was the head of, what you might call it, a legislative body that oversaw the prison. And it was very clear from my discussion with this woman that she was overworked. And I was starting to think at that point that I was interested in the politics of punishment for my dissertation, but I had no idea what that meant or what a project would look like. And so I, just being an industrious grad student, said, how about I come and intern? How about I come up here once a week, take the train from Berkeley up to Sacramento, the state capital, and help you out, as well as try to understand sort of on the ground the politics of punishment. And so I did that. And as I was doing that, I quickly realized that there was this organization called the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, which is the labor union that represents prison officers in California, was an incredibly influential political player. Like whenever I was involved in discussions around penal policy, people would ask, well, where's the union stand on this? So it was organically, I became really interested in the union, the extent of their power, how they wielded it, the effects of it. And so that became my doctoral dissertation, so I was interested in this union, but as a way of thinking about the role of organizations and interest groups in shaping what I came to term the penal field and really around the politics of punishment. And so that became my doctoral dissertation and then eventually my first book.
Can you provide a couple of examples to illustrate and illuminate how do unions shape California's penal expansion, and what does that reveal about the state's politics of crime and punishment?
And no, that's a really good question. When I got involved in this study, there wasn't much written on the union from an academic's perspective. Most of it was from an advocacy perspective or the newspapers and so forth. And there's sort of a view that the union was really critical in driving mass incarceration in California. And as I started to study that, I knew that wasn't the case. The timing just didn't work. I mean, the union really developed and grew and became powerful in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Mass incarceration in California started in the early 80s. And what I came to learn is that as there was this prison boom, they hired all these officers, right? And the union therefore gained all these members, gained all this money, and then were very skillful political players. And so what they did is they helped then create some very powerful victims' rights groups. They were influential in the campaign for 3 strikes and you're out. So they were, what I came to understand is they helped anchor mass incarceration in California. And so this, I came to understand, is a classic story of policy feedback, which how policies, as they become implemented, right, is we tend to think like, what are the outcomes? Do they do what they're supposed to do, right? And we think about how politics shapes the policies. Well, the policy feedback perspective asks how policy shapes politics, right? And so it was through the sort of policy project of mass incarceration, you got these new organizations that then reshaped the penal field and what was possible and even thinkable. And this was a very classic kind of policy feedback effect that, that folks weren't really talking about at the time. And so it was about how mass incarceration really restructured politics and how then those politics sort of shaped what was conceivable in terms of reform or other ways of addressing mass incarceration.
The book came out in 2011. So now, after 15 years, looking back, do you see the union's influence as having shifted? And if so, how?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I must qualify my answer by saying I haven't really studied them closely in years. But even as I was finishing up, my book and then writing some follow-up articles, they did start to change a bit. It softened their tone around penal policy, became sort of a little bit less involved in that. And I think, again, we can return to the policy feedback perspective, is the policy feedback doesn't just go one way, right? Is that it can unleash all kinds of forces. And part of that was, a backlash against the union from the courts, from the media, from some politicians. Their image was quite tarnished which then can influence contract negotiations and so forth. And so they softened around that way. And I think they've continued to do that to some extent. I think they're still pretty influential in the legislature. But again, we're talking about unions, so it's not just an interest group that's lobbying campaign contributions. It's also doing contracts, and the contracts are incredibly important, right? Because they not only shape, compensation, wages, and benefits, they also shape working conditions, and working conditions mean, that can affect policy implementation. What can be implemented? Can you actually make the officers do certain things or not? It can affect downsizing. Are you able to downsize the prisons and save money through, the most expensive elements of incarceration are the actual facilities and the staff, right? And it affects, if you can investigate sufficiently and discipline officers and so forth. And so I think they're still very influential in shaping the working conditions of the prison, which then are also a policy question because working conditions and policy implementation are tightly linked.
So interesting. It's a space that we should continue to watch closely. I would like to move on to Breaking the Pendulum now, a very influential book, a fantastic book. So the book challenges the idea of a simple pendulum swing in criminal justice developments, so to speak. What motivated you and your co-author to critique this metaphor?
Teaching. That I would be in the classroom and I would be using this metaphor and say, hey, and then I'd be like, no, that's actually not true. No, that didn't actually happen. Wait, we got to qualify it in this way. Wait, this metaphor is not very useful. And then thinking about, well, why? What's going on here and how does, and then, yes, that was the pendulum itself became something to argue against, but then it got us thinking about how is that represented in scholarship and on punishment in particular, and thinking about sort of models that tend to talk about big media, sort of large-scale ruptures and shifting from one era to the next, and the somewhat validity of those, but also the limitations. And so, yeah, it was teaching and thinking about like, oh wait, like I'm using this, but then by the time I'm done with the class, I've completely destroyed it. And so let's think about that. And then I collaborated with some really wonderful colleagues who had some similar ideas on this stuff, and it turned into eventually a book project that initially just was, again, my own frustration with myself, and then some informal conversations with good friends that just sort of like, and eventually we were like, all right, let's write this. Let's write something.
This is so interesting, and proof that teaching can really actually help you challenge deep-seated beliefs and I would say even misconceptions at times. So for listeners who may have not read the book, will you please explain how does an agonistic model of penal change help us better understand the long struggle over penal policy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea is that this actually stemmed from my research. This is a logical extension from my research in California, right? Which was about like over any policy, there was deep struggle, right? Even though the union say was very influential, there were always people fighting them. And then when you think about like people often say, oh, there was this radical change, right? We focus on the policy change itself. But but being there thinking about it, you'd see like these are years, sometimes decades in the making, right? With fits and starts. And then you'd see like when a side, quote unquote, lost, they didn't just go away, right? Like they would reformulate their ideas. They would come back again and again. And so there was just this ongoing battle, but it was an unequal battle, right? Is that some organizations, some actors had far more power in various forms than others. And so that sort of shaped the struggles, as well as broader developments in the political economy and so forth would provide opportunities or not. And so it was thinking about the way, it's really about how, again, my overarching theme of my work really has been penal development in one way or the other. And it was thinking about that process of penal development and thinking about this agonistic struggle, this ongoing sort of grind and people struggling in different ways, and how that sort of shapes the potential for for change over the long term. And that's really and that's also why I think, it's definitely true that in certain periods, punishment takes a certain shape, right? Like I would never argue that in the 90s, 2000s, even today, in the US, for example, that punishment's, definitely quite, it's punitive, right? But it's also kaleidoscopic in that it's also braided in these ways. There's still people pushing for rehabilitation and similar kinds of things. There's people, there's always this struggle going on that makes punishment more, variegated than we tend to think when we think just in terms of eras. Like this is the punitive era, this is the rehabilitation era. And it's the punishment, it's the agonistic struggle itself, we argue, that helps us understand why it's variegated, even if there is an overarching orientation at any given time.
Absolutely. So this was very, very helpful, again, for listeners who may have not read the book yet. So as you were mentioning, so this is an ongoing struggle and developments are, of course, happening day in and day out. So are there any contemporary examples? So the book came out 9 years ago, in the past few years after the release of the book, that would further illustrate the argument. Can you think of one or two kind of major examples?
Sure. I mean, it's happening all the time. I mean, if you look at, I've, for the last 10 years, have been focusing on the pretrial process and bail and so forth. At the same time, you have people pushing to make conditions of bail more stringent, letting people, having fewer people get out on bail, raising the costs of financial bail in some states, and right? In other states, you have people, Illinois just completely eliminated cash bail. And so every time it seems we're in this period of really robust reform, and it's true, there was some really major reforms in New Jersey, Illinois, and several states, right? But then there's the pushback, right? And this is a struggle. And so now they're trying to roll back some of those. And then also, in Texas, there was some legal decisions that really sort of reshape punishment, particularly in Harris County. And now they're trying to push legislation to do it. So it's this ongoing struggle that shapes it in ways that are often unclear from when things begin. They develop in these sort of unclear, confusing ways. And again, I think it's because, again, people don't stop struggling. And also it's all messed up in politics, is that, there's opportunities for people, once you actually pass reforms and so forth, or even pushing them, those become opportunities for politicians to really rail against it. Right? You see this with Trump and bail. It's like, that's their big thing, is they want to rail against bail. Bail reform is soft on crime and so forth. So I think the bail world is, bail and pretrial policy has been, it really is a great example of what we argue in the book.
And this leads us to your latest opus, co-author with Joe Soss, Legal Plunder. So in this book, you and Joe describe predatory policies and practices as central to the modern criminal legal system. So what does, once again, for those who may have not yet read the book, what does legal plunder mean in this context?
Yeah. And I should say it's specifically about the U.S. It's a very large book. Does many things, or tries to do many things. And so making it a comparative or even bringing in much examples from other countries was beyond the scope, though we are very interested in thinking about, for us thinking about, but also other people thinking about how this may or may not apply in other countries. So legal plunder is, what it's getting at is the way that resource extraction through the criminal justice system has both changed and grew since the 1980s. Now, there's always been resource extraction through criminal justice institutions, right? But this is mostly focused on labor. So you could go back to convict leasing, to chain gangs, to plantation prisons, to industrial prisons in the North during the Gilded Age. Right up into the present moment, there's always been extensive labor, extracting resources primarily from people who are convicted of crimes. Well, since 1980, there's been an explosion of practices that focus on extracting financial resources, money from legally entangled people, but especially from their families and broader communities. And so what legal plunder refers to is that process, this resource extraction that, labor extraction still exists, but it's really overshadowed by this financial extraction. And so in the book, we describe that. We try to explain it. We try to explain the consequences and the political struggles over it.
From outside of the US, at times there is this understanding of US criminal justice as a single monolith. But then we know that that's not really the case. You have the federal system, and then most of criminal justice action takes place at the state and local level. So here I think that this kind of multi-level understanding of government is absolutely key to how legal plunder operates. So what role do local governments' fiscal pressures play in sustaining predatory practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so in the U.S., we have a federal system. What that means in the criminal legal context is that there is a federal criminal justice system, a federal prison system, federal police, law enforcement, but each state has its own system. Each state has its own prison system, state police, and then police are local. They are city. I mean, there's the state and federal police, but policing, as we tend to think about it, is actually a city function. And then local jails are ran by the county sheriff. And so it's very much a decentralized, fragmented kind of system. And so much of legal plunder, what we call criminal justice predation, has operated at the state and local levels. And there's good reason for that, is that in the 1980s, there were various policy changes that led to fiscal crises, both at the state and county level. Those, the federal government devolved responsibilities from the federal government to the state government to the local government. There were limitations on taxation and so forth that, really created these fiscal crunches at the state and especially at the local level. Much of that was met by austerity politics, the cutting of public services. And some of that happened in the criminal legal system, but it was really hard to do because of the politics of tough on crime, where it was really, you couldn't just close prisons. You couldn't reduce policing and so forth. And so there was this real crunch for public managers, both the state and local level, to try to find resources, and what they had control over were things like fines and fees, asset seizure, developing contracts with private companies where they would get commissions and offload their responsibilities. So the story we tell really is one of, of public managers, politicians adapting to crises, right? And seeing these as legitimate ways of doing it because of, popular images about people who are incarcerated, very racialized images of, people that are always sort of gaming the system, that are, your quote unquote welfare cheats, your, gangbangers and so forth. And so yeah, it really helps explain it. The other part about federalism is it's really hard to coordinate responses, right? And so part of the story we tell is an institutional one where, right, like the courts, they might want to reduce their caseloads, but they don't control the police. So the police are the ones sending it to the courts. Well, the prisons might want to control their prison population. Well, the courts have an incentive to send these people out to this, they send them out of the county to the state prison. And so they don't actually cooperate in a way because it is sort of fractured. There's this concept of the correctional free lunch where the counties, they basically get a free lunch by sending people to prison because then the costs are on the state and not the county, if they were to keep them in there. And so, yeah, I appreciate you asking that question because the government structure in the U.S. is actually really key, really important part of this story.
Absolutely. I think it was Frank Zimmering who wrote that there's no correctional free lunch. You already mentioned a few successful initiatives at the local and state level to resist or reverse this legal plunder dynamics. But I was wondering, what was the process? What were the dynamics through which these successful reforms happened? My focus would be to what extent these punitive lobbies profiting off legal plunder oppose these changes. Who are the major players? Are they organized in any way? I'm thinking from my research and criminal records, you have these criminal background check agencies that, again, are organized and they can really exert pressure on any discussion in terms of expungement or limiting disclosure. So when it comes to legal plunder, how are these punitive lobbies organized when it comes to debate to reduce the extraction?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are those who are directly benefiting from the extraction that are, politically involved, whether that be, the corporations, right? But it's also those that Joe and I argue that people support these policies for a variety of reasons, right? There are those, yes, that directly benefit financially that promote them, right? And that's both public and private, right? There are public actors who might not approve of these things in an ethical, moral kind of sense, but their agencies are dependent on them, right? And so they see, getting rid of some kind, whether it be a probation fee or a court fees, like they see it, as an existential threat because they're also so squeezed, even if they don't support it in that way, right? But there's also, people that support them for other reasons, like, for social control reasons, or, the police unions, prosecutors, so forth, might support, for example, cash bail, which is the really main mechanism of financial extraction in the pretrial thing, not because of the extractive character of it, but they understand that cash bail is also a very good way of detaining people because they can't afford it, and they're afraid that reform will actually let more people out on pretrial. And so there's actually, the law enforcement lobby has actually been very strong in opposing some of these kinds of measures.
So excellent. So public punitive lobbies and not necessarily only private actors in this public-private partnership profiting off these practices. Very, very interesting. So for the final part of this podcast, I would like to move to something that is personal, but is also very, very public in a way in terms of your personal life, your work, and where they overlap and intersect. So you moved to Minneapolis 20 years ago, and you've been living there ever since. And we all know that Minneapolis has been in the spotlight in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, and the conversation about police abolitionism or defunding the police really had Minneapolis at its epicenter. So my first question would be, how has Minneapolis changed socially, politically, emotionally since George Floyd's murder? And what unresolved tensions continue to shape the city's struggle over public safety and community trust?
It's a deep question. Maybe I'll answer it in or try to address it in a roundabout way, which is to say, right, the murder of George Floyd happened about 6 years ago. The federal government, for all intents and purposes, occupied Minneapolis for several months this year. In January and February, sent over 3,000 federal agents to our state, and really flooded our state with federal agents from ICE and Border Patrol and others. So that was, and so it was really fascinating and moving to see when this happened, how quickly and passionately people organized in Minneapolis to protect their neighbors, right? And to sort of try to stand in the way of the federal government taking people from, taking our neighbors, basically. And I think there is, people have argued, and I see some validity to it, that what happened in 2020 with the so-called racial reckoning and the resistance to policing, particularly sort of warrior-based kind of policing, it really set the stage for this mobilization, right? And just to give you a concrete example is during the George Floyd uprising, and there were these widespread mutual aid networks that developed, very informal, and as soon as this happened, they sprung up again. And that meant delivering groceries to vulnerable people so they didn't have to they didn't have to leave the house to do that. And some of the people that were involved in these, in mutual aid for this struggle were the very same people that had done it last time or had known about it and became involved. Some of the people that were involved in it were very involved in the development of these ICE watch networks, which meant, trying to really understand what ICE was doing and where they were going. And this is, I'm sure you saw the stuff with people blowing the whistles, which would be, following them as soon as they get out of the car, blowing the whistles, honking the horns, being able to, it's basically an early notification system. And so I think, a lot of the networks and also just the, collective disposition and connections were really established back then. But also, this is to a large, it's been much broader, I would think. And there's just a lot of various things that have been happening with the resistance. So, yeah, it's also been interesting with the police because this is very much a movement that's up against the federal government and federal police forces, and the local police have pretty much stayed in the background. And I think to some extent have gotten some goodwill by, the statements by the police chief, but also not to a large extent, not aiding the federal forces. So it's been very interesting to see. There might actually be a little bit of trust built in that way, though, that's to be seen if that were to hold. And again, a lot of it's, geared towards the federal government and the feeling that we've been occupied by our own government.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting, insightful, and I would say helpful answer, because we really need to know more, especially from outside the United States. So just one final question. How is your thinking about the U.S. criminal legal system evolved across your three major projects and all the published work, all the research in between them?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably demands a little more reflection than I've given it. I think there are, again, my major focus has been on penal development, and I've become, in one sense, much more structuralist of, meaning thinking about what are the large scale factors, developments, particularly around the political economy that make it really hard to fundamentally transform, the criminal legal system, but also to develop other ways of producing public safety and community well-being through social supports. And, I was thinking of David Garland's new book, and he has this idea of the bandwidth of political economy, that the political economy in the U.S., really it allows for change, but it's all within this sort of bandwidth. So I think I become somewhat, because as much as I see change on the ground, it seems like there is sort of bracketed in a way. And I don't mean that to be fatalistic or deterministic, but that's just sort of, over the, almost 20, 30 years I've been doing this, is that, in a large part, things, they've both changed a lot and not changed. So I think that's the one thing I hold. But the other thing is how much things do change and how much struggle there is on the ground and how much people are doing that's often out of the public sphere that you just see. Again, with the Minneapolis, what's going on, like to see these, ICE watch, basically cop watch. These are very much like the old sort of Black Panther and American Indian movement cop patrols, right? Of like following, and these amazing networks have developed, and just the kind of things that people produce on the ground, these amazing college programs in prisons that I'm lucky enough to go to, and policy changes, like again, Illinois fully getting rid of cash. There's just like so much amazing stuff that I've had a privilege to sort of observe or to participate in that makes me actually very optimistic. And so holding these two things together is a challenge, but it's something that I'm much more committed to, if not like, oh, it's just the structuralist, or in a lot of my work has been about like, let's focus on the actors and the context, the specific context, and that does allow for a fair amount of agency. And so really holding those two things together and also like without becoming fatalistic or overly optimistic, and just sort of appreciating the work that's happening and just keep plugging away, because that's what I think people are doing in communities and in political networks and so forth. And so I don't know, I guess it makes me even more inspired to see people be able to create change and to keep going even against these really, really substantial, obstacles that have to do with just the very structure of our government, right? All the veto points and how hard it is to pass national legislation that would create, really robust funding for social services and alternatives, right? And, the real political incentives of maintaining sort of this tough on crime kind of thing, and how quickly people already use it, and the history of race. And, there's some really just deep historical structural things that make it really hard to create change, but people do. And to me that, I think to me that's what I find really, really amazing.
Thank you so much. This was truly inspiring. So Josh Page, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Law Pod. Again, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.